Everybody hear me okay? Awesome. Thanks for coming. I'm Phil Grimes. I am a vulnerability researcher and exploit developer, pen tester, and I'm pretty much breaker of things with SecuriCon. And today I want to talk a little bit about a web app vulnerability that really doesn't get the respect I feel that it deserves in the wild. It's kind of a lesser known, lesser exploited, lesser dealt with issue. But it really is fairly significant, and hopefully if the demo gods are smiling upon us today, we'll go from web app vulnerability to root, and that should be pretty fun. So thanks for joining me. So cross-site request forgery. Anybody heard of this before, right? Awesome. So that's a great thing. So that's more hands than any other opportunity I've seen anytime I've given this talk. There's usually only a couple of people. Sadly, most of the time I've given this talk, it's been to developers, which is a really scary thing. The fact that they don't understand that, they don't realize that this is an issue, and normally it's the deer in the headlights, crickets chirping, and all that good stuff. So we're going to talk about it today. Let's go CSRF'n now. I try to work in some music homage whenever I get the chance, so throwback to the Beach Boys. And yeah, let's just go ahead and get started here. So who am I? Some of you saw me talk yesterday. My demo or my introduction is usually pretty standard because although I change daily, the basics of who I am pretty well stays the same. So in the physical realm, I do a lot of different stuff. I have to wear many different hats. I am a martial artist since I was a kid. I've studied a bunch of different styles of martial arts, mainly because, you know, martial arts, first of all, I was kind of a little bit of an unruly kid, right? So as a martial artist, my parents were kind of worried about, well, do we really want to enroll this 6-year-old kid in Taekwondo? Are we sure we want to have him kicking people in the face when he doesn't get his way? Well, I've learned, you know, not only does martial arts develop a huge sense of self-respect, respect for others, situational awareness, and so forth, but in having the opportunity to study different styles, you know, we've got like karate, for example, Taekwondo. These are highly striking arts, right? So you learn a lot about yourself physically, the physical limits of your personal physical body. Then again, with other styles that I've gotten to experience, like Hapkido, Aikido, things like this, where you're learning more how to manipulate your attacker as they're coming at you. So there's a lot of circling, a lot of joint manipulation, a lot of pressure points, a lot of figuring out, not necessarily how can I beat this person into a puddle, but more how can I just make them stop trying to hurt me. I'm also a pirate by blood. My sister recently did a study on the Ancestry.com website, and we found out that we do have ties to an Irish pirate from the 1500s. So that's really kind of cool to be able to say. I haven't gotten an eye patch yet, mainly because they only come in black. I can't find them in purple. I'm a biker by nature and at heart. That really is what I spend a majority of my time doing. I'm fortunate enough to be the president of a local chapter in Columbus of a worldwide motorcycle club, and it gives me an opportunity to meet people from all over the place. We do a lot of charity work. We spend time with kids. We have a lot of people from various backgrounds, and you know, that kind of works into understanding the world around me. You know, it goes back to the situational awareness stuff, learning how people interact with each other, learning how different groups interact with each other, and not to mention that riding a motorcycle is probably some of the most fun you can have with your clothes on. I'm also blessed to be a parent. I have 5 kids at home. I started entirely too early. I'm fortunate enough, though, to say that my oldest just recently turned 18 and doesn't have any kids yet. She also hasn't been in jail, so I consider that a win. And all of this kind of boils into the root, right? So we're going to talk about a lot about root causes. Hopefully, I'll be showing you how to get root on the box we're working with. And the root of me is I'm a hacker. I've been breaking things since I was a kid, not just software, but hardware. I love to just understand how things work, why they do what they do, and how can I make them do something different. My first time actually that I can really remember hacking on anything was my mom's alarm clock. You know, before I was old enough to get myself up and off for school, the alarm clock had that annoying I wanted to figure out how to make that damn thing stop. So I took it apart and tried to rewire it, and needless to say, she didn't like the fact that I couldn't really put it back together properly again. But that's me in a nutshell, at least in the physical sense. And for those of you that don't know, in the digital world, I am the grape ape. I try to sport the purple whenever I can. I guess I look kind of like a gorilla, so that's kind of, I know, I earn the handle, but that's me. If you don't follow me on Twitter. I love to engage. I like to talk about anything related to life in general, because I find that in order to be an effective attacker, an effective person in the InfoSec community, you have to be pretty versatile. So I have a bunch of different interests. I'm happy to engage. If you don't get enough of hearing me run my mouth this weekend, catch me on Twitter. And I like tabs. This is a typical day for me. I normally have 3 different browsers open with 5 to 20 different tabs open at a time. Do we have people in here that use the tab browsing features? Right? So at the root, there's that word again, of what we're talking about today, this is part of our issue, right? So having multiple tabs open in the browser is a great thing, but it also presents us with some problems because, as we'll see, if I can trick you into doing something that you shouldn't or wouldn't normally do, we had a great talk earlier on some social engineering tactics, but if I can social engineer a user into clicking on something that they shouldn't or wouldn't normally, then this can tend to be the downfall. So why are we really here? Now, we're not talking about something new. I'm not releasing new code today. I'm not cool enough to do that. I'm not, actually, the exploits that we're going to see are kind of old simply because most of the stuff that I do in the real world, I'm not really allowed to talk about. So this isn't something new or elite. You're not going to see Neo come busting in the door here anytime soon. This is kind of an old issue. In fact, cross-site request forgery is very similar to cross-site scripting. We've heard a lot about SQL injection. All 3 of these are injection attacks, right? So this is what we're talking about. The fact that our development teams are still releasing applications out into the world, and a lot of times we're finding that the input that's received from the users isn't necessarily validated properly, if at all. So that's what we're talking about, injection attacks being the root issue here. And abuse of trust relationships, just the fact that we put so much stock in our trust between a user and an application, the browser and the application, our organizations and the user, that if we aren't monitoring and paying attention to the trust relationships, they can easily be abused. And that's what really all injection attacks revolve around, right? SQL injection, if the data is not validated properly, then you're liable to access back-end information on the database. Cross-site scripting, you can do some pretty scary stuff with that, downloading or accessing files on a remote machine. Cross-site request forgery is very, very similar, and it's pretty dangerous and pretty nasty thing. So CSRF, XSRF, it's usually pronounced CSRF, also called the one-click attack or the session riding. But my favorite reference to it is the Confused Deptuy attack, right? And the reason that, that it's called this is the browser kind of acts as the deputy. We put that trust in the browser to basically do its job. And when you find an attacker that starts doing something or bending a system to their will, manipulating specific requests, the browser starts to see these requests really in a uniform manner. The requests all kind of look the same for the most part, and we're not talking about anything that's super crazy. This is normal behavior. Cross-site request forgery, SQL injection, and cross-site scripting happens because the browser is basically doing what it's supposed to. The problem is that with our applications not necessarily doing what we intend or expect, and with the fact that we put that trust in the user, we don't always know who's interacting with our stuff. So that becomes an issue. You never know if it's going to be Mary from Human Resources who's legitimately accessing an application, or if it's somebody like me who is really looking for a way to break something, to hurt you, to do something that I shouldn't be allowed to do. And if we're not looking at this stuff at the beginning, if we're not dealing with this from the development standpoint, a lot of times security becomes the afterthought, and we tend to overlook it, and then before we know it, things can spiral out of control. This is just how browsers work. Trust again. I'm big on trust, right? So does anybody do any kind of trust mapping in their environments? Wow, no hand. Oh, I see one hand. Awesome. First time in any talk I've given that I've gotten that. So thank you. I hope you're being honest, because that's awesome. Trust is a big deal, right? If we don't know how our systems are supposed to work, and I'm not just talking technical or digital systems, if we don't know how all of our systems work in conjunction with each other, a lot of times we find vulnerabilities in trust. If we aren't doing that trust mapping, if we aren't mapping the surface area, the attack surfaces within our organization, and if we aren't understanding how all of these different components correlate with each other and interact, then we tend to find a breakdown. Cascading failure starts to happen because we abuse that trust. So cross-site scripting, for example. When we talk cross-site scripting attacks, this is something where the user, we're exploiting the trust that a user has within a particular site, okay? But cross-site request forgery is different in that it's manipulating the trust that the site has for the browser. So again, it's not something specific, but what we're talking about here is even if we're doing session management right, okay? The browser doesn't necessarily know in these attack instances where the attack is coming from. It doesn't understand that maybe you clicked on a link that's past this malicious request because there's not that level of validation. Sometimes it can be as simple as, checking the referrer from where the request is coming from. A lot of times that's going to stop us in our tracks when we're talking CSRF vulnerability. But it gets even worse. I do a lot of forensics. I do a lot of after the attack, how did it happen stuff. And cross-site request forgery gets extremely dangerous because those attacks come from the IP of a legitimate user. So if I get a legitimate user to click on a malicious request and execute my attack, the IP address, my IP address, the malicious IP address, is never found. It's very, very difficult from a forensic standpoint to track this down. When you start seeing it in the logs, all of this traffic looks like it comes from somewhere where it's supposed to. So the next thing you know, the men in black show up and poor Mary's wearing the silver bracelets. So we have to be paying attention to trust and understand how, again, all of these components work together and why trust is so important. And also to evaluate the threat model of our organizations and to make sure that we understand the attack surfaces so that we're not protecting ourselves from something that's not likely to happen. I've seen a lot of really scary stuff with cross-site request forgery. Just a few examples here on the slide. I've seen, it's kind of cool. When I first discovered, well, I didn't discover the vuln by any means, but when I first started playing with CSRF, it was cool to be able to say, hey, click on this link, and I log you out of Facebook or something, right? That looks cool. People think you're cool. You get internet fame, +5. But when you start finding other issues, I've actually found a problem in the wild with a very well-known firewall device that we could change the firewall rules. Not only that, but just simply with an asterisk, we can reset all the firewall or delete all the firewall rules. So we start to see where this becomes a bigger issue. So if you're doing segmentation right, enclaving your networks to where you've got particular areas cordoned off and I'm able to reset these rules, that opens the scope up, right? We broaden that attack surface so that ups the ante a little bit. It makes my opportunity to find your holy grail a little more likely. Remote code execution, which hopefully we're going to see here today. I got my fingers crossed. Live demos always worry me. But remote code execution, so that can be damaging, right? If I can make your machine do something just by you clicking on a link, that becomes extremely scary. And go a level deeper, we've actually even seen issues where we've had compromise of the root certificate. Totally changes the game there, right? If we can no longer trust PKI, then what do we have to be able to trust when it comes to our interactions online? If we can't trust our certificates, everything else breaks down. But wait, there's more. Anybody heard of the Sammy worm? Right? 2005, in 20 hours, the Sammy worm was able to compromise more than 1 million machines using this type of vulnerability. Being able to dynamically use CSRF attacks as part of the payload in a cross-site scripting attack, we see significant damage. So we start to see by chaining different vulnerabilities together, by exploiting multiple issues at one time, we start to see, again, that scope broadens. The attack surface widens. The chance that I'm going to be able to do something that's seriously damaging and not just popped up a, ooh, I hacked you message box on your screen is increasing. All right, so let's break something. Can we see that? I didn't know if this was going to show up too well here, but let's talk a little bit about this. So the exploit code, again, not my code, nothing new, but what we're looking at here is we're going to be exploiting the vulnerability in this news post PHP script. And essentially, we're going to be we're creating a new post, and the web app, we'll talk a little bit about the web app that we're going to be fighting here shortly. But we use a little bit of JavaScript to point to a cookie stealer, and the first thing that we're going to do is just steal somebody's sessions. So again, if you're not doing session management properly, and I'm able to steal your cookies and then replay that, then I can just become the user. No authentication required, just copy and paste a little bit, and poof, we've got it. That show up a little bit better. The cookie stealer is not a difficult piece of code. 2 lines of PHP, we're able to steal somebody's cookie, and again, I can just assume that I'm Mary from HR. I always hope people will see the irony in the click here, right? Thank you. All right, so we break out of the slides here, and this is, everybody hold your breath. Hopefully everything is going to go well for us here. Okay. So the application that we're dealing with is called E107. I think the project's been abandoned because it's ripe with vulnerabilities, and they're still highly available. So if you like what you see today, I recommend you go ahead and grab the latest versions of this, play with it a little bit. There's a lot of really fun things that you can do in the term of web app exploitation, so check it out. But this is an older version, so you're going to see, it does say, hey, there's a newer version available, whatever. But it's basically WordPress-ish, right? So we're talking a blog post or a blog type system that makes these posts under the news category, which is the script that we're going to be exploiting today. Gives you the ability to make publicly available downloads. So if I wanted to upload some executables or something that I was sharing with the world, we could do that here. Contact forms and so forth. So a similar control panel, we've all seen this before. I'm sure everybody's dealt with a CMS. There's nothing really exciting here, except just to kind of give you a chance to look at the things that we deal with, the different opportunities for places. And again, this thing is ripe with different issues. So play with the pages. There are several different vulnerabilities within this package. But what we're going to do, and I have... somewhere. Well, I thought I had the code up here. Okay, so we're just going to call this. So essentially, what you're going to do, the attacker would create the malicious file that we looked at the code at a little bit earlier, and I've got a couple here because we're actually going to run a few of these. And the first one for the JavaScript attack. So if I can get you to click on the dancing gnome, then the request gets passed through the browser, and it would point to my malicious HTML file here. So essentially, this is one of the craziest things. An extremely dangerous exploit, right? But it's one of the most unsexy things you'll see in InfoSec. It's not cool. We're not going to dump a database. We're not going to see really anything crazy happen. It's kind of sad the way that this actually comes about, because it's just that quick. We have the cookie up in the URL bar. But more importantly, we actually were able to write the cookie to a file. If I could spell. Why didn't you do it? Thank you. There it is. There it is. So there, we were able to write it to a file, so now I can go back and retrieve it later. Now, granted, hopefully, most of our users are starting to pay attention when we're having awareness at meetings, and they're realizing, oh, hey, something doesn't look right here. My session ID is showing up in the browser window, but I can go back, I can steal the cookie, I can impersonate the user. We have a valid issue. But we take that a step further here. There's also some SQL injection issues in this application. So if I combine the cross-site request forgery with SQL injection, can anybody tell me what the line is, what the SQL injection attack is going to do here? Can we see that? Right? And more importantly than that, we've also changed the script that we're exploiting here. So we're now actually creating a publicly available download with the credentials of the user that's logged in. Let's see if we can make this one work. This guy. And again, super anticlimactic, right? It's kind of sad, but, oh, hey, look. Oh, and I forgot to erase those earlier. Haha, that's great. But, all right, so we have this download that wouldn't have been there had I prepared properly, which is sad because I've been preparing for 2 days. But so we have this file now that once we go and look at it again, we just go back and browse and check out our downloads page. Why aren't they available? Heh. Awesome. Well, that's sad. So the download doesn't actually, it's not, so the reason that this isn't showing up, this is part of the complaint, right? The user community for this E107 app, one of the issues that people complained about, you have to create multiple download categories. So you have to create, like, category 0 is actually like my public downloads or whatever. And then you have to create a child of that parent that it will actually show up. And because my child isn't created, it's not publicly available. Although what should have happened, had this worked right, you'd click on the downloads page, and a download would show up, and it says, oh, hey, there's our hash, and so it'll have like admin and the password hash there. And it's not hard to crack password hashes, right? Especially when, in this case, it's just MD5 twice. So there's really no encryption, there's no major encoding, it's just MD5 twice, and poof, we have the password. So knowing that that part's not going to work correctly, let's see if we can get the other thing to work here. Yeah, I love failing for a live audience. It's great. So this time we're going to change things up a little bit. How's that? A little better? Although it's out of, all right. So this time, what we do is I reach into my nice collection of shells, and instead of, although the SQL injection's still there, we're focusing more this time on, now I'm actually adding a malicious download to the file, or to the application rather. So once we execute this, hopefully it's going to give us shell access. And I'm hoping that that's still actually going to happen, even though the download's not really going to show up. Right, because the file already exists. But it does work, I promise. I did it just before I came. I just forgot to delete the files. But the My Shell upload is here. So now if I pop out of the virtual machine, go to a browser. Anytime now. There we go. And browse to the path where hopefully this file should be. We have our shell. Now, there's a few issues here with, I mean, we're obviously, we've got a shell, right? But A, it's not interactive, and B, we're running on a Linux box, we can tell here by our the information that we've got from the shell. And what happens when you are uploading a shell, or any file, I guess, default to an Apache server? It's not operating as a really privileged user, right? See, we're actually operating as a limited user, so if we, who am I? So I'm this www data user, which we know doesn't really have a whole lot of privileges. So that makes things a little more difficult, right? How do we escape out of this? How do we take it to the next level? Yeah, great, you've got a little bit of access, but what can you really do damaging with this? Well, we're going to first use the level of access that we have. Oh, let me cancel this and point out, yes, these are writable directories. All this is done by default. I was gonna kind of mock up a fully functioning blog and put a bunch of grape apes in there, but I figured it would be a little more impressive considering the anticlimactic nature of the vulnerability to just show you what it looks like out of the box. So if we browse to upload some, our favorite kernel exploit so that we can make that available here later. We see that we were actually able to upload that without any problem. Although it's owned by DubData, it's still, right, we aren't necessarily going to be able to exploit that. If I were to run this right now, it's going to run the first stage of the exploit, but it's going to fail because the limited permissions within the www user aren't actually going to let me escalate the privileges. But the shell gives us the opportunity to kind of add some layers to our attack. So if we use the beautiful function here for the back connect, make sure that my 99. Start a listener. 199. Oh, I know why that's not going to work right now. Firewalls are dangerous. Gotta have the receiving firewall off if you want to accept the incoming, right? So start our listener again. And now we have an interactive shell. So it's simple to back connect that through, and these are freely downloadable tools. This isn't something that, you know, is super elite. I mean, C99 is one of my favorites, but I found the back connect functionality in that is spotty at best. This one here gives us the opportunity. Now we have our interactive shell. So I can see the process is running. If I who am I see that I am legit www data, right? Back to the shell, and we see our file is hopefully still available. So we have our privilege escalation exploit. And what does this look like? So again, this is kind of not really old, a little over a year old here. And basically it takes advantage of some issues within the kernel that will eventually, we create an executable out of it, we run the executable, and then we're able to get root through the vulnerabilities that we have within the web app. Okay, so we spawn our shell in the same directory where our web shell was. We have our privilege escalation. Create an executable, simple as pie. See this guy? And the box is pwned. So we've officially gone from something that nobody's going to think about in the CSRF vulnerability to root from the outside. Now, if we combine that with, I mean, God forbid, we don't have this issue running on a production network with something where I can overwrite your firewall rules, but we start to see where that cascading failure becomes a huge, huge issue. So simply by playing on, not validating, by trusting our users, we've been able to go from the outside all the way in and own the box. And then, God forbid, I hope that you're not using or reusing passwords anywhere, because that becomes a trivial issue at this point. So the good news is the sky isn't falling. This isn't the end of the world. The problem is we have to change the way that we think about how to mitigate the issues. So the cool part about this is, first of all, are there any developers in here at all? Couple? Awesome, thank you. A lot of people that are developing in .NET these days say, oh, well, we don't suffer from those issues. Well, first thing I have to caveat with is PHP wants you to fail, so if you're working in PHP, you have to do this kind of stuff. If you're working in .NET, if you're working in ASP, you're right. For the most part, it makes it a little more difficult, but out of the box, it's not configured to do so. You have to activate a token in order to be able to make this stop. With PHP, it's as simple as adding another line of code. It's really not that difficult. What we're talking about, though, is adding a token. I didn't do it. I was in church. So what we're talking about here is just adding a pseudo-random value, adding a token to every request, and trying to match up to make sure that the token is what we expect it to be. So when you initiate the session, you instantialize the token, and then with every request, we have to validate and make sure, do both parts match? Does the session name match the token that's expected? So that means then when every post is requested, it's gonna be checking those things, right? So the hard part becomes, I spend a lot of time evaluating forms in different applications to see, is it vulnerable to CSRF? I can get access to almost every form just by looking through burp or another proxy to be able to see what the request looks like, what form fields are being submitted. But what I'm not going to be able to do is predict that token that's given at the instantiation of the session. That's how we need to stop this. And again, it's as simple as adding one line of code here. So where our typical input, first name, last name, looks like this, if we simply add, oh, did my battery die? My battery died. If we add this line 43, the JP session ID, which is a default name, hopefully you're going to change that. I mean, I am not a developer by any sense of the means, so this is just for example. And then a pseudo-random, we know there's no such thing as random, right? But if we try to come close and make sure that we're not just incrementing the number by 1 or 5 or some number that I'm going to be able to guess by creating a bunch of sessions on the application, if we make it somewhat random, then it's going to be nearly impossible for the attacker to guess that to be able to trigger a successful CSRF attack. And then we have to check it. So every time a request comes in, it's going to check to make sure that the session name field is available. It's going to make sure that the session token matches the token, the identifier that was set at the beginning of the session. And if they don't match, then it's going to invalidate the request. So again, just by adding that one line of code, or in the case of .NET, just by switching the token on and saying, include this every time. The nice thing is .NET does it for you, but again, PHP likes to be difficult. We all want our apps to work. That's the problem that we face. The developers in the room, I'm sure you'll feel the pain. The development cycle sucks. We have to get our apps out there. They have to work. It has to be pretty. We have a deadline to meet. Business units want it to go. They want it now. They want it yesterday, and they want it pretty and shiny. Right? So we're fighting against this, but unfortunately, we're letting security continue to fall by the wayside here. So we're not validating. We heard in a talk yesterday that trust but verify is dead. That's true, because you don't know who's interacting with your application. You have to validate absolutely everything that gets passed as an argument, absolutely everything that a user can touch, because if you don't, then you never know where that mistake can become fatal. Here's a few links on some of the research. Some of this stuff is really great. Wikipedia has a great article on cross-site request forgery. I'll make these slides available both to Notacon and, of course, the video here, and they'll be on my website after. And I'd love to talk about it here more throughout. So that's essentially cross-site request forgery. Does that give you a little better understanding of what the issue is, right? And why we really need to change our thinking and make people pay attention to this stuff and say, hey, refactoring our code isn't necessarily a bad idea. Hey, building this stuff into the development lifecycle is probably a wise thing to do. And ways to contact me. Again, I'm all over Twitter, and feel free to email me or stop me. I'll be here for the rest of the con. And I think we have a little bit of time left, so if there's any questions or any comments or any concerns, I'm certainly happy to take those. Yes, sir. Oh.
I was just going to say the scripts that scripts you're using, like the post-exploitation.c, and some of the shells. Where did you find those, and where would they be available? So
the exploit code, the CSRF exploit code itself, and the privilege escalation code, both of those come from the exploit DB. It's not new. It's been there for a while. I think that the privilege escalation was the newest of the code that we saw, and that's from January of 12. What other code did I use there? Oh, the stuff for the web application stuff, that's super old. I mean, it's pretty old, a couple years old now. The shell stuff, I've got the privilege of working with a couple of honeypot developers that give us a lot of good information, and I've been able to collect shells that's kind of helped a lot. But they're also all over. If you just Google web shell or interactive console, interactive command line, there's a ton of web shells out there. And most of them, I mean, it's not hard to do this stuff. If you can run the PHP script, if you can get it on the site, there's a lot of really cool ones out there. Pentest Monkey actually also has a really good one that is just it skips all the pretty GUI stuff, and it's just a reverse, like a back connect, basically. Yes?
One thing that might be worth pointing out with the microphone. Yep.
Makes me not have to repeat it.
Especially for honeypots and stuff, you know, C99s and et cetera, a lot of them have like configurable, tunable options like, hey, send me an email when this shell comes up on a box. There was some research actually pretty recently showing that a lot of these within the shell code and the obfuscation that's already in there actually has a second beacon back to the developer that you as the end user of that shell doesn't think is there.
Right.
So be careful using them on pen tests and other things, because you actually might be giving a live system during a pen test to
Good
the
caveat.
Yeah, so just a thought.
Well, and most of the time, that's one thing. Don't use somebody else's web shell on a pen test unless you review the code yourself. The one I can speak specifically for Pentest Monkey. That's a legit shell, and it really is just a back connect. But again, have somebody, if you aren't comfortable with reviewing the code, look at it. Don't use a tool that you don't understand what you're doing. That's something that should be said for pen testing across the board, and really anybody in InfoSec. If you are using a tool, you should know how to do the same thing manually, essentially. So find out how to, in the case of a shell or something like that, learn how to build your own. Thank you for that, by the way. I wouldn't even have thought about saying that.
So I have a comment on the comment. If you're anything like me and you hate having to reverse binaries and you don't want to get out your hex editors to do that and you don't trust the code, just fire up TCP dump and see what it's sending across the network. So if you fire it up in your lab and you're not seeing the shell call home or anything, then you can have a certain level of assurance that it's working like you think it is.
Well, and I said in the beginning here, root. The word root is going to be the fundamental word of the presentation, right? At the root of that statement, everything should be tested. We should be testing patches before they're deployed. We should be testing tools before they're used in the field. We should be testing software before we launch it to the public. Everything needs to be thoroughly tested, and we have to know that we can trust, right? That word trust keeps popping up. We have to know that we can trust what's going across our wire. And silence is golden. I think that's it. Going, gone. Thank you again.